Hey there, welcome back to another story where we dig into the lives of people who changed the world, quietly and sometimes without getting the credit they deserved. If you've ever scrolled through a website, watched a YouTube video, or even checked your email, then you've touched the legacy of one man. A man who didn't ask for money or fame, but still managed to wire the planet together. Today, we're talking about Tim Berners-Lee, the soft-spoken Brit who gave us the World Wide Web. And here's a challenge for you. Stick around till the end, because we'll reveal a little-known vision Tim had for the web. A secret idea most people have never heard about. One that could still change how we think about the internet today. Before we dive in, do me a quick favor. Hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and drop a comment telling me how often you think you use the web each day, and whether you've ever stopped to wonder who built it. All right, let's go back to the beginning. Not to Silicon Valley, but to a quiet London household in the late 1950s. Back then, the word computer still sounded like science fiction. But in the Berners-Lee home, it was dinner table talk. Tim was born in 1955 in London, to parents who were both computer pioneers. His father, Conway, had worked on the Ferranti Mark I, one of the first commercial computers in the world. His mother, Mary Lee, was also a mathematician. They didn't just talk about numbers, they talked about logic, structure, and systems. Most kids grew up on bedtime stories and cartoons. Tim grew up on binary code and computational logic, and that left a mark. As a boy, Tim wasn't particularly flashy or loud, but he was endlessly curious. He loved trains, model building, and above all, taking things apart to figure out how they worked. If it had wires, switches, or dials, it was fair game. He built his first computer using parts from an old television set. Let that sink in. Not a school project, not a team effort, just a kid, some scrap electronics, and the itch to connect things. He didn't know it yet, but that would become a theme for the rest of his life. By the time he got to Oxford University, Tim wasn't the kind of student who aced every exam. He got into some trouble for hacking into school computers. Nothing malicious, just curiosity turned to action. But more importantly, he showed a pattern, a tendency to see systems as puzzles to be fixed, improved, or made more elegant. While studying physics, he also built gadgets on the side, one of them being a computer that helped him with typesetting. Most students were content to scribble notes. Tim was writing programs in his spare time, trying to make things more seamless, more efficient. But none of that, not the physics lectures, not the university prestige, could predict what came next. After graduation, Tim bounced between jobs in computing and tech. He was sharp, no doubt, but he wasn't climbing any ladders. He wasn't chasing money or launching startups. He was simply building, connecting, organizing. And eventually, that led him to CERN, the European Organization for Nuclear Research, a giant institution filled with brilliant minds from all over the world, all trying to crack the universe's secrets. But there was a problem, one that bugged Tim more than anyone else. Each researcher at CERN was using their own computer systems, different software, different formats, no common structure. You couldn't easily share data across departments, let alone across countries. Information got lost, work got duplicated, progress slowed to a crawl. To Tim, it looked like a giant mess, a beautiful mess, full of knowledge, but totally disconnected. And in that mess, he saw potential. What if there was a way to organize all this information? What if you could link everything together? What if knowledge didn't live on islands, but flowed freely? That question would become the foundation of everything that followed. And in the next episode, you'll see how that one quiet frustration, with folders, files, and incompatible computers, turned into a handwritten proposal that would change history. But it wasn't met with applause. In fact, his boss called it vague but exciting. Yeah, that happened. So, how do you turn a vague idea into the architecture for the entire internet? That's exactly what we'll explore next. Let's rewind to 1989. At CERN, where physicists were smashing particles and rewriting the laws of nature, Tim Berners-Lee was quietly rewriting something else: how humans organize and share knowledge. It started with a memo. Title: Information Management, a Proposal. Target audience: his boss. Goal: to fix the chaotic mess of incompatible systems and scattered documents at CERN. Now, let's be honest. Most proposals go straight to the nice idea, maybe later pile. This one nearly did too. His supervisor scribbled 4 words across the top. Vague, but exciting. That might sound like a brush-off, but in Tim's world, it was permission to keep going. And that's exactly what he did. The core of his idea wasn't flashy. In fact, it was beautifully simple. He wasn't inventing a new computer or launching a product. He was proposing a way to connect information, using something called hypertext. Words or images that, when clicked, lead you somewhere else. Hypertext already existed, sure, but no one had used it to unite documents across the globe. Tim's twist was this: what if every document, image, or bit of knowledge could be linked to another, no matter where it lived? To make that happen, he needed 3 things. First, a way to identify any document on the network. That became the URL, a uniform resource locator. Yep, those web addresses we type every day, that was Tim's doing. Second, a way for computers to communicate, to request and send documents. That became HTTP, Hypertext Transfer Protocol. And third, he needed a language to describe the documents themselves. That became HTML, Hypertext Markup Language. 3 tools, 1 quiet man, and a vision no one else had fully seen. Now, if this were a movie, there'd be a montage here. Furious typing, code whirring across green screens, Tim working late at night while rain batters the window. But in real life, it was even simpler. Just Tim, a Next computer, and a problem he couldn't let go of. He built the first web browser. And get this, it wasn't just a browser. It was also a web editor, meaning you could not only view information, you could also create and publish it. That part, that was revolutionary. The web wasn't just for reading, it was for building. He also created the first web server, hosted on that very Next machine. He even put a sticker on the computer that said, "This machine is a server. Do not power it down," with 2 exclamation marks, no less. By 1991, the first website was live. And what was on it? Not cat memes, not online shopping, but a plain page explaining what the web was and how to use it. In classic Tim fashion, it wasn't about him. It was about others. About making the system accessible, useful, and open. And now we get to the part that still blows people's minds. He didn't patent any of it. He didn't trademark the web. He didn't try to sell it. He gave it away to everyone for free. Why? Because he believed the web belonged to the people, that it should be universal. A space where anyone, anywhere could publish, share, and access information without asking permission or paying a toll. That single decision, not to commercialize, may be one of the most important in tech history. It's why the web grew so quickly, why it became ours instead of theirs. But it also meant the future of the web would be out of his hands. And as you'll see in the next episode, that freedom came with a cost. Because once people realized how powerful the web could be, well, it didn't take long for the corporations to arrive. By the early 1990s, Tim Berners-Lee wasn't just scribbling proposals or theorizing about digital utopias. He was coding, alone mostly, just a man and a machine, a Next computer, black and boxy, sitting on a desk at CERN, creating the architecture for something that would one day power nearly every corner of human communication. He called it the World Wide Web, not the internet. That already existed. But the web, a layer on top, a way to link and navigate the vast ocean of information sitting on computers all around the world. And it was fragile at first. There were no websites, no search engines, no Google, no YouTube. Just a single page hosted on Tim's server, explaining what the web was and how to create pages of your own. What's astonishing is not that he built it, but that he built so much of it himself. He wrote the first browser, which wasn't just a tool for viewing content. It allowed users to edit pages directly, a feature he considered essential. The web, in his mind, was supposed to be interactive, editable, a true conversation between people and ideas. He also created the first web server, which handled requests for web pages and delivered them to browsers across the network. That server lived inside the next machine on his desk, and it carried a warning label written in capital letters. "This machine is a server. Do not power down." Behind that simple sticker was a fragile reality. If someone unplugged that computer, the web, at that point, would vanish. And yet, what made the whole system elegant was how little it demanded. You didn't need expensive hardware. You didn't need proprietary software. All you needed was a bit of code, a connection, and a willingness to learn. That was by design. Tim didn't want a gated platform. He wanted a platform where anyone could contribute, regardless of their background, wealth, or geography. Information, in his philosophy, was a human right, and he was building the infrastructure to make that right real. By 1991, he made the first website public. It wasn't flashy. No images, no colors, no animations. Just plain text explaining what the web was, how to create web pages, and how to set up your own server. But that plainness was the point. He wanted clarity, accessibility, and a low barrier to entry. And here's the part that continues to puzzle people decades later. He didn't commercialize it. He could have. Any lawyer or investor would have begged him to patent the core technologies, HTML, HTTP, and URLs. These were the building blocks of a trillion-dollar digital economy. Had he claimed ownership, he might have become the richest man on earth. Instead, he gave it away. To Tim, the idea of fencing off knowledge, of monetizing the act of linking ideas, was repugnant. He believed in universality, the principle that the web should work for everyone, everywhere, without permission or toll booths. That decision, to keep the web open, made all the difference. Suddenly, universities, governments, hobbyists, and even curious teenagers could start building websites. It wasn't a product, it was a platform. Not a business plan, but a public utility. And with that, the web began to spread. People from all over the world started building digital spaces, homepages, forums, digital libraries, early online shops. The architecture was flexible enough to support almost anything. But it was still young, still fragile, still idealistic. Tim, for his part, remained at CERN, quietly supporting the expansion. He wasn't leading a company. He wasn't on magazine covers. He was still writing code, refining standards, and answering emails. But as the web grew, so did the attention. Media outlets began to notice. Tech communities buzzed. And not long after, business interests came knocking. The web's doors were open, and that meant anyone could walk in, including those with far more aggressive plans than Tim ever imagined. He had built the roads. Now others were arriving to pave them in gold. By the early 1990s, the web was no longer just a clever tool at a physics lab in Switzerland. It was beginning to ripple outward, quietly, at first, but with the kind of force that would soon become impossible to contain. The code was out in the world. The instructions were public. The gates had been left wide open, and people came pouring through. What started as a solution for scientists quickly became a playground for students, hackers, dreamers, and yes, even entrepreneurs. University campuses were among the first places to light up with web activity. Students were building websites in their dorms. Professors were publishing syllabi. Researchers were uploading datasets. But the real turning point came in 1993, when a group of developers at the University of Illinois released a new browser, Mosaic. It was easy to use, had a graphical interface, meaning people could now click on images, not just lines of text, and it worked on multiple operating systems. Suddenly, The web wasn't just something techies understood. It was becoming mainstream. With Mosaic, the web gained color, fonts, images, and momentum. Tim Berners-Lee watched this unfold with a mixture of awe and caution. He hadn't expected the uptake to be so fast. What amazed him wasn't just how far the web reached, but how quickly people began to imagine what it could become. By 1995, companies were launching websites by the thousands. Amazon started selling books online. eBay let people auction off Beanie Babies and baseball cards. And Netscape, the successor to Mosaic, went public, kicking off what would soon be called the dot-com boom. The web, which had been born in a quiet lab, was now the beating heart of a gold rush. And that's where things got complicated. Tim had imagined the web as a tool for connection, a universal canvas where knowledge could be shared freely. But he began to see another version emerging, one built on marketing, user tracking, closed ecosystems, and corporate walled gardens. It wasn't just websites anymore. It was empires. Portals with their own rules, their own data silos, their own ambitions. And with each IPO, with each new billionaire minted by stock options and banner ads, a question grew louder. Had Tim made a mistake by giving it all away? The answer to him remained no. But it wasn't a blind no. It was thoughtful. It was cautious. He didn't regret the gift, but he now saw clearly what was at stake. Tim believed that if the web were to fulfill its true potential, someone had to protect its core principles: universality, openness, decentralization, and that someone, reluctantly, would have to be him. So in 1994, he founded the World Wide Web Consortium, or W3C, based at MIT. Its mission? To guide the web's development, keep it standardized, and resist the fragmentation that was already starting to creep in. It wasn't flashy work, no trending hashtags, no million-dollar launches. But the stakes were enormous, because if the web split into incompatible platforms, if browsers stopped speaking the same language, if companies started locking users into proprietary tools, the universal web would collapse under its own weight. Tim worked to prevent that, tirelessly. He rallied developers, negotiated with tech giants, and drafted open standards that would allow innovation without wrecking interoperability. He didn't seek control, just balance. A way to ensure the web remained more than just a marketplace. A way to ensure it remained a commons. But the winds were shifting. Banner ads became targeted ads. Search engines became gatekeepers. And the companies moving in weren't just building on top of the web. They were starting to reshape it in their image. Still, millions of people were discovering the web for the first time, and for them, it was magic. Email, forums, news that updated by the minute, access to libraries, hobbies, conversations across continents. For every pop-up ad or cookie tracker, there were also new voices being heard, new tools being built, and new possibilities opening. The question wasn't whether the web had changed the world. It had. The question now was who would shape what came next. By the late 1990s, the web had become a force of nature. It was spreading through homes, offices, and schools at lightning speed. It connected more people every hour. It powered new companies, new jobs, and entirely new ways of thinking. But somewhere in that flood of innovation, the original idea started to slip. Tim Berners-Lee had created the web as an open space, one where anyone could contribute, explore, and connect. A place without borders, without gatekeepers. But as the stakes grew higher, that openness came under pressure. And pressure, in this case, meant money. Suddenly, companies weren't just building websites. They were building ecosystems, walled platforms, closed networks. They had no interest in keeping the web universal. They wanted control. And the way to get it was to bend the rules, or worse, rewrite them. Tim wasn't naive. He understood that growth would bring commercialization. What he didn't expect was how quickly the web's foundational ideals would be traded away for short-term gains. In response, he doubled down. He had already launched the World Wide Web Consortium, or W3C, a sort of digital United Nations for the web. It brought together developers, academics, corporations, and governments to agree on standards, not to control the web, but to protect it. It wasn't glamorous work. Negotiations dragged on. Tech companies clashed over small details. But to Tim, the details mattered. Because hidden inside a piece of code or a formatting rule could be a trap, one that turned a public space into a private one. One of his biggest fights came over something seemingly technical, the idea of embedding digital rights management, DRM, into the very structure of the web. To most users, DRM just meant limits on what you could copy or share. But to Tim, it meant something more dangerous. The creeping idea that users couldn't be trusted, that information needed to be locked down by default. He opposed it loudly. Others pushed back. Some of his closest allies in the open web community felt betrayed when the W3C allowed DRM standards to move forward. It wasn't a clean battle. It was messy, public, and painful. And it wasn't the only one. As internet service providers started favoring certain content, the fight for net neutrality reached the mainstream. Tim spoke at summits, testified before governments, and warned that the web's openness wasn't guaranteed. It had to be defended, actively, repeatedly, and without apology. He didn't always win. In fact, he often lost ground. But he refused to walk away. Unlike many other inventors of his generation, Tim never joined a corporation. He never sold his vision to a boardroom. Instead, he traveled the world, talking not about stock options or IPOs, but about freedom. Freedom to speak, freedom to connect, freedom to code. And as the web grew into a giant, as it touched every bank, every newspaper, every school, and every phone, his voice, though modest, carried more weight. What made him different wasn't just what he said. It was what he represented. A living reminder that the web didn't come from a company or a patent office. It came from a belief that information should be shared, not hoarded. That connection should be easy, not expensive. That technology should serve people, not control them. Of course, not everyone listened. The early 2000s brought a tidal wave of change. Google became a verb. Facebook became a digital country. Amazon rewired global commerce. These platforms weren't using the web. They were reshaping it. And yet, beneath all the algorithms and apps, the basic architecture Tim built was still there. Still working. Still open. And that was his triumph. And his burden. He had created something so flexible, so powerful, that it could serve nearly any purpose, which meant it could also be used for manipulation, division, and surveillance. And that left him with a question, one that kept returning. If the web was no longer what he intended, did he have a responsibility to build something better? By the early 2010s, the web looked nothing like it had when Tim Berners-Lee first imagined it. Sure, the bones were still there. HTML, URLs, HTTP, the invisible scaffolding he had written decades earlier. But the spirit? That had become harder to recognize. Instead of millions of small sites run by curious individuals, the web had become dominated by a handful of massive platforms. People didn't build their own pages anymore. They logged in, uploaded, scrolled, liked. The web had shifted from a read-write culture to a read-only platform economy. Tim Berners-Lee had spent much of the past 20 years defending openness. But now, he decided to try something different. Not just defense. Reinvention. That's where his next big idea came in, a project called Solid. At first glance, Solid sounded abstract. A new web architecture built on decentralized data storage, where users controlled their own information. But what it really was, at its heart, was an attempt to give the web back to the people. Right now, most of our data, our photos, messages, clicks, contacts, live on servers owned by someone else. Companies collect it, profile us, and sell access to those profiles. That's the business model. Solid flips that upside down. In Tim's vision, you'd store your data in personal pods, and you'd choose who could access what. You'd share a medical record with your doctor, a shopping list with your grocery app, a photo album with a friend. And if you changed your mind, you'd revoke access instantly. In other words, you'd own your own digital life. It was a bold plan, not just technical, but political. It challenged the very structure of the web as it existed. And unsurprisingly, it was met with skepticism. Could it work? Would people care? Would companies allow it? Tim didn't pretend to have all the answers. What he had was something better, a track record. He had once rewired the planet with a single idea. Why not do it again? But let's pause here, because this is the moment I promised you at the very beginning. The idea Tim had for the web, the one few people know about, was this. He once imagined the web not just as a network of pages and links, but as a giant collective brain. Not a search engine, not a marketplace, not even a social network. A thinking system where human knowledge, creativity, and curiosity could come together in one evolving space. Where machines and people could learn from one another. Where intelligence wasn't centralized but distributed, emerging from millions of tiny contributions. It wasn't a fantasy. It was a blueprint. He wrote about it in the early days. He described it as a semantic web, where data would be linked in a way that machines could understand, making the web not just readable, but comprehensible. Pages would talk to each other. Concepts would connect. Meaning would emerge. Imagine a web that doesn't just show you recipes, but knows your dietary needs, understands your schedule, and suggests meals based on what's already in your fridge. Imagine a web that learns from the way scientists collaborate and helps build new theories. Imagine a web that doesn't push ads, but asks better questions. That's the vision Tim once quietly wrote down. It didn't go viral, but it never left him. And it raises the question, what kind of web do we want? Because now, more than ever, we're at a crossroads. We can keep going the way we are, with centralized platforms, endless notifications, and algorithms we barely understand. Or we can rethink what the web is for. We can remember that it was born from a desire to share, to collaborate, to connect across boundaries. Tim Berners-Lee didn't build the web for clicks or profit. He built it because he believed people, when given the right tools, could create something extraordinary together. And maybe that's still true. We just explored how one man, Tim Berners-Lee, quietly gave the modern world its digital skeleton. But now, we're stepping back 5 centuries, to a time when power wasn't coded in HTML. It was carved with swords, sealed with blood, and fought over in royal bedchambers. And at the heart of that power struggle stood a man who was never supposed to wear the crown. He was the 11th child in a family of warriors, hunchbacked, sharp-tongued, underestimated, a loyal brother, a cunning noble, and eventually one of England's most infamous kings. This is the story of Richard III, the king who wasn't born to rule, but took the throne anyway, and changed English history forever. So if you thought tech drama was messy, wait till you hear what royal succession looked like in 15th century England. Before we dive into betrayal, backstabbing, and battles, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment. Who do you think was England's most controversial monarch? And stay with us until the end, because we'll reveal a chilling twist about Richard's final resting place, a place that stayed hidden for more than 500 years. Let's rewind to October of the year 1452, to Fotheringhay Castle in Northamptonshire, England. That's where Richard was born, and almost forgotten. He was the 4th surviving son of Richard, Duke of York, a man with a dangerous claim to the English throne. And in a time when lineage meant everything, being 4th in line was about as politically useful as being the 11th string on a lute. Richard grew up in a world teetering on civil war, a brutal, drawn-out power struggle now known as the Wars of the Roses. Two royal houses, York and Lancaster, clawed at each other for decades over who had the better claim to the throne. The result? Shifting allegiances, dead uncles, sieges, and a lot of decapitations. His early childhood was shaped by instability. His father, ambitious and assertive, died in battle when Richard was just 8 years old. The following year, his older brother Edward took the title of Duke of York, and soon after, he took something bigger, the crown. In 1461, Edward became King Edward IV after smashing the Lancastrians in battle. Suddenly, Richard, now just a teenager, was thrust into the high-stakes world of royal politics. But even as his brother ruled from London, Richard wasn't given a seat in the spotlight. He was sent north, far north, to the rugged lands of Yorkshire. There he was trained not as a courtier, but as a commander, a soldier, a man who could lead troops and hold borders. He learned fast. At a time when noble boys were still fumbling through Latin grammar, Richard was negotiating with Scottish warlords and organising defences against rebellion. He showed discipline, loyalty, and an instinct for administration that few expected from a king's younger brother. By his 20s, Richard had become the Duke of Gloucester, and arguably one of the most powerful men in the kingdom, though he wielded his power far from court. He remained fiercely loyal to Edward. When their wayward brother George, Duke of Clarence, tried to stir rebellion, Richard stood firm. When the crown needed muscle, Richard brought the army. And when it came time to marry, Richard didn't grab for scandal or status. He married Anne Neville, daughter of the powerful kingmaker, Earl of Warwick, securing both love and land in a single move. Still, Richard had enemies. Whispers about his appearance, hunched shoulders, a crooked back, followed him everywhere. So did rumours that he was too ambitious, too cold, too clever for his own good. But he kept those whispers in the shadows, until everything changed. In April of 1483, King Edward IV suddenly died. He was just 40. His eldest son, Edward V, was only 12. And that, dear listener, was the beginning of a crisis that would change everything. Because suddenly, Richard wasn't just the loyal younger brother anymore. He was Lord Protector of the realm. And protect it he did, though not in the way anyone expected. It's April of the year 1483, and the throne of England is suddenly without a steady hand. King Edward IV, strong and charismatic, is dead at 40. In his place, a 12-year-old boy, his son, Edward V, is meant to ascend. But Edward is too young to rule alone. And so his uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, is named Lord Protector. Now here's where the lines start to blur. Richard was loyal, that part's not in doubt. For years he had served his older brother faithfully. He fought battles, suppressed rebellions, and never once made a move for the throne. At least, not until Edward was gone. But with the king's death, the game changed, quickly and completely. Edward V was in the care of his mother's family, the Woodvilles, a wealthy and powerful clan that had always made Richard uneasy. They were new nobility, climbers, opportunists. Richard, a dyed-in-the-wool Yorkist, saw them as dangerous. And now they had their hands on the boy king. Richard moved fast. He rode south with a troop of men, intercepted the young Edward on his way to London, and escorted him, gently but firmly, to the Tower of London. At the time, the Tower wasn't a prison. It was the traditional lodging for monarchs awaiting coronation. And for a while, everything looked normal. The coronation was planned for June. Richard called for calm. But behind closed doors, he was building a very different plan. Within weeks, he'd taken control of the Royal Council, arrested key Woodville allies, and persuaded Parliament to delay the coronation. Then came the first truly ominous move. Richard placed Edward's younger brother, 9-year-old Richard of Shrewsbury, into the Tower as well, to keep his brother company. What happened next is one of the greatest mysteries in English history. The two boys, known today as the princes in the tower, were seen less and less. By the end of the summer, they had disappeared from public view altogether. No public explanation was given. No funeral. No announcement. Just silence. In their place stood a new king. In July 1483, Parliament declared that Edward IV's children were illegitimate. Their marriage, it claimed, had been invalid, which meant the young princes had no right to the throne. Richard was crowned King Richard III, and almost instantly a storm of suspicion rolled in. Had he killed them? Hidden them? Paid someone else to do it? Did they die of illness, or were they smothered in their sleep? No one knows for certain. The truth was buried along with the boys, wherever they ended up. Even in his own lifetime, Richard faced whispers. Later writers, especially Shakespeare, would turn those whispers into thunder, painting Richard as a deformed villain who murdered his way to the crown with a smile and a dagger. Was it fair? Maybe not. But history doesn't always favour fairness. What we do know is that Richard's grab for the crown wasn't entirely selfish. England was in chaos. The Woodvilles were consolidating power. Civil war was once again on the horizon. Richard may have believed, genuinely, that only a strong adult king could hold the realm together. But if that was the case, he made a fatal mistake. Because no matter how noble his intentions, the disappearance of 2 royal children was a moral fracture the country couldn't ignore. And that crack, once opened, wouldn't close. On 6th of July, 1483, Richard of Gloucester became King Richard III. And if the crown fit awkwardly, it wasn't just because of the whispers. The country was tense, uneasy, not openly rebellious, but far from loyal. In the wake of the prince's disappearance, trust had fractured. Nobles who once served the House of York with pride were now watching their backs, and their nephews, more carefully. And yet, Richard wasn't idle. Whatever else one says about him, and historians have said plenty, he ruled actively and intelligently. Within months of his coronation, he began a series of reforms that aimed to ease the burdens on ordinary people. He established the Court of Requests, which allowed poor subjects to bring grievances without paying exorbitant legal fees. He passed laws against corrupt land seizures, streamlined the legal code, and tried to limit fraud in property dealings. Not exactly the profile of a cartoon villain. And in the north, where he'd ruled as Duke of Gloucester for over a decade, he remained genuinely popular. Towns like York mourned him later not as a tyrant, but as a just king. Still, the stain of the tower clung to him. It wasn't just that the princes vanished, it was that no one could say what happened. And in that silence, myths grew. Richard never issued a public statement about their fate. He never explained, clarified, or deflected. He ruled and moved on. But the country didn't. Plots began to simmer. Old enemies found new courage. And in the West, a name began to echo again. Henry Tudor. Now, Henry was hardly a household name. His royal blood was thin, Lancastrian through his mother's side, distant and politically flimsy. But what he had was momentum. Exiled in Brittany, he was gathering supporters, Yorkists disillusioned with Richard, Lancastrians desperate for a banner, and mercenaries hungry for a fight. In October 1483, the first attempt at rebellion burst out, the Buckingham Rebellion. It failed, crushed by bad weather and poor planning. The Duke of Buckingham, once Richard's ally, was captured and beheaded. But it was a warning. The kingdom was volatile, and Richard was sitting on a throne that refused to settle. Then came the death of Queen Anne, Richard's wife. Her health had been in decline, and when she died in early 1485, rumours flew fast and furious. Did Richard poison her? Was he planning to marry his niece, Elizabeth of York, to consolidate power? There's no hard evidence for either claim. But in a court already haunted by shadows, it didn't take much to believe the worst. Richard was now alone, politically, emotionally, and increasingly, militarily. Across the Channel, Henry Tudor prepared to invade. He had the backing of the French. He had ships. And more dangerously, he had a message that he would marry Elizabeth of York, unite the rival houses, and end the civil wars once and for all. It was simple, romantic, and powerful. Richard, for all his administrative competence, could not compete with that kind of myth. He began preparing for war. He moved his forces north, summoned loyal lords, and tried to hold the kingdom together. But the cracks had spread too far. By August 1485, Henry had landed in Wales. His army was smaller, but the tide was with him. As he marched east, more nobles defected. Some were uncertain. Others were waiting to see which way the wind blew. And Richard, he didn't run. He didn't hide. He rode out to meet Henry on the fields near Market Bosworth, ready to fight, not just for his crown, but for his legacy. It was August 22nd, 1485. A Monday. Hot, clouded. The air was thick with sweat and dust. And on the fields outside the village of Market Bosworth, two men prepared to decide the future of England, one with a crown, the other with a claim. Richard III had about 12,000 men. Henry Tudor had maybe 5,000, maybe 6. But as every soldier knows, battles aren't just about numbers. They're about timing, terrain, and which side believes more fiercely that history is on their side. Richard had the better position. He controlled the high ground. He had cannons. He had cavalry. But what he didn't have, not anymore, was certainty. Too many nobles had wavered. Some were watching from the sidelines. Others had promised support in secret to Henry. And worst of all, one of Richard's most powerful allies, Lord Stanley, was playing both sides, keeping his army apart until the outcome was clearer. Still, Richard was not the kind of king to sit back and hope. He wanted a clean, decisive victory. And as the two armies collided, he did something that stunned both sides. He charged. Not a symbolic gesture, not a gallant wave. A full-speed, spear in hand, death or glory charge aimed directly at Henry Tudor himself. This was personal. Richard wasn't just trying to win the battle. He was trying to end it, by killing his rival outright. And he nearly did. Accounts say Richard cut down Henry's standard bearer. He got within feet of Henry. His sword struck, his horse reared, and for a moment it looked as if the crown might survive. But then everything shifted. Lord Stanley's forces moved in, not for Richard, but against him. Surrounded and outnumbered, Richard's men began to fall. His horse was killed beneath him. He fought on foot, refusing to flee. One chronicle claims his last words were, "Treason, treason, treason." Another says he simply shouted, a horse, my kingdom for a horse." That last line, of course, is Shakespeare's, and while poetic license fills in the blanks, the truth is stark. Richard died fighting, in the mud, in full armour, in the chaos of hand-to-hand combat. With his death, the crown passed to Henry Tudor, who was declared king on the field, Henry VII. He married Elizabeth of York, uniting the warring houses, and ushered in the Tudor dynasty. And Richard III became a legend. But not the flattering kind. Within years, he was painted as a monster, a child-murdering usurper with a twisted spine and a blackened heart. By the time Shakespeare's play hit the stage a century later, Richard was a villain so theatrical he practically twirled a moustache. It was brilliant drama, and possibly terrible history. The real Richard was more complex, ambitious, yes, but not uniquely cruel. Effective in governance, brave in war. A man shaped by the brutal politics of civil war, not born of evil. And then, for centuries, he vanished. Quite literally. No one knew exactly where he was buried. Rumours said a friary in Leicester. Others claimed the body was thrown in a river. Time covered the truth in layers of forgetfulness. Until 500 years later, when history pulled one last twist. For over 500 years, Richard III had no known grave. He was said to have been buried in a small friary in Leicester, but the site was destroyed during the Reformation, its location gradually forgotten beneath centuries of urban growth. Over time, the memory of where Richard lay faded, replaced by the louder version of his story. The villain king, the tyrant with a crown soaked in blood. But in 2012, something unexpected happened. A small team of archaeologists and historians, led by the Richard III Society, launched a modest excavation project. Their goal wasn't flashy: to confirm whether the site of the old Greyfriars Church, hidden beneath a municipal car park, still held the king's remains. It was a long shot, the kind of idea people politely smile at and secretly dismiss. And yet, within just a few days, they found something. Beneath layers of gravel and concrete, they uncovered a human skeleton. The bones were twisted slightly, the spine showing signs of a pronounced scoliosis, a condition that would have caused one shoulder to sit higher than the other, just as some accounts of Richard had described. The skeleton also bore signs of violence, injuries to the skull, deep cuts to the body, likely inflicted during battle. It had been hastily buried, without a coffin, beneath the remnants of what had once been the choir of the friary church. The team knew they had something remarkable, but they didn't rush to conclusions. DNA testing was arranged, comparing the remains with descendants of Richard's sister. The results, when they came, were staggering in their certainty. The body was Richard's. After more than 5 centuries of myth, the man had been found, not in a tomb, not beneath stained glass, but under parking bay number R. His rediscovery forced a reckoning. The image we'd inherited of a deformed tyrant who clutched power through murder and malice began to crumble under scientific light. The real Richard had scoliosis, yes, but he wasn't the twisted caricature Shakespeare had immortalized. His face, reconstructed from the skull, revealed a young man with intelligent eyes, soft features, and nothing monstrous about him at all. For many, it was unsettling. How had the story gotten so far from the man? How had a king who reformed laws and fought bravely ended up remembered as a hunchbacked devil? The answer lies not in Richard's life, but in what came after. The Tudors, victorious through Richard's death, had every reason to rewrite his legacy. They needed to justify their reign, to paint Richard not just as defeated, but as illegitimate, corrupt, and grotesque. History, after all, is written not by the fallen, but by those who survive them. And Shakespeare, writing under Tudor rule, knew exactly what kind of king his audience expected to see. Yet there's something moving, almost poetic, about Richard's late return. He was given a proper reburial in Leicester Cathedral in 2015, with thousands attending and millions watching around the world. A man once buried in haste and shame was now laid to rest with dignity, ceremony, and debate. Because that's what Richard continues to inspire. Debate. Was he a usurper or a pragmatist? A murderer or a scapegoat? A tyrant or a tragic figure in a brutal era? The truth, as ever, lives somewhere in between. Richard was not a perfect king. He made ruthless choices. He sought power in a time that rewarded cold calculation. But he was also a reformer, a capable general, and a loyal brother who may have believed deeply that the kingdom needed him more than it needed a child on the throne. And in that parking lot, beneath layers of time, he became something few kings ever become. He became real again. Thanks for listening to the story of Richard III, the king who was never meant to rule, and who nearly disappeared from history altogether. If this story challenged what you thought you knew, leave a comment. Do you see Richard differently now? And don't forget to like and subscribe, because next time we're heading to the gritty streets of industrial America to meet a man with steel in his hands and empire on his mind.